On a cold, rainy night, a man quietly left his newborn child by the riverbank and walked away without looking back. 25 years later, that child returned, stood before him, and spoke words that made the father lower his head in absolute silence. But that wasn't the part that broke him the most. The rain began in the late afternoon. At first, just a few scattered drops fell on the hot asphalt, but soon the entire town of Willow Ridge seemed buried beneath a thick curtain of water. The rain continued, gusts of wind lashing against the fragile maple trees, sending leaves spinning through the air and whirling in puddles like lost petals in a storm. On the road leading to the old Weeping Bridge, headlights flickered, casting dull glimmers on the darkened pavement. In the distance, a train whistle echoed, long and muffled, among the mountains surrounding the town, a warning from some unknown place. Everyone had gone home. Everyone, except one man. A white pickup truck pulled up next to the rusted railing. The door opened and Richard Whitmore stepped out. He had no umbrella or hat. His damp gray hair clung to his forehead, and his wrinkled shirt was soaked through. No one knew why a man as successful as Richard would appear in such a lonely, bitter place, in such relentless rain, in the middle of the night. In the back seat of the truck sat a blue plastic cradle. Richard opened it carefully, not out of tenderness, but out of fear. The baby, a boy, lay curled up inside, his cheeks flushed, his tiny hands shifting slightly in the cold air. He didn't cry, only let out a faint, weary moan, as if he were already tired from fighting to survive. Richard bent down and lifted him with trembling hands, not from the cold, but from something much deeper, something he didn't want to name. He walked to the edge of the bridge where the river churned, white foam bubbling like open wounds. He placed the baby on the wet concrete and stood still for a long moment. "You're not supposed to be in my life. I should never have been born." The whispered words faded into the rain, and Richard turned and walked back to the truck. The engine roared, tires splashing through the water. A piercing, high-pitched cry suddenly tore through the air like a blade, but he didn't look back. The truck disappeared into the darkness. A few blocks away in an alley, 12-year-old Jason Walker was following dog tracks on the wet ground. His dog Rocky had escaped earlier that afternoon when the wind blew the kennel door open. He had promised his sister he would find him before nightfall, but it had been dark for a while now, and the rain hadn't stopped. Jason was wearing his dad's old coat, collar turned up, and his sneakers were soaked through. Each step felt heavy, sometimes slipping in the mud. He looked around, calling out for the small animal. "Rocky, where are you? Come back, please!" No bark answered him, only the sound of rain and water gurgling through a clogged gutter. Jason turned into a narrow path leading to the river, a place where he'd seen Rocky roam many times. Under the dim yellow glow of a street lamp about 100 meters away, everything was tinted pale gray. That's when he heard it, a faint, stretched-out cry that faded like air being strangled. Jason stopped, listening intently. Another cry, clearer this time. It wasn't a cat. It wasn't a dog. It was a baby. "Is someone there?" Jason shouted, but no one replied. He quickened his pace, heart pounding. The closer he got to the river, the louder the crying grew, like it was tearing through his chest. He had to crouch down, pushing through tall, rain-soaked weeds, brushing aside wet branches. A blue plastic cradle appeared in the dim light, upside down, lodged against a tree. The river had risen halfway up the cradle, nearly submerging it. The baby lay there, soaked, trembling, as fragile as a breath. Without thinking, Jason threw himself into the water. The river was cold, as if it sprang from the earth's core, slapping his face like 100 frozen hands. He lost his footing, fell forward, his knee striking a slick rock, pain shooting up his leg. But he didn't cry. His eyes were locked on the cradle swaying in the water, as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. He sat up, grabbed a nearby tree root with his trembling hands to steady himself, then lunged toward the cradle, gripping it with both arms. The rain made everything slippery, but he held on tight, as if letting go would mean losing everything. With one final effort, he pulled the baby to his chest, bent down, and used every ounce of strength to lift it from the water that seemed determined to swallow them both. Wind howled, rain splashed against his face. A bolt of lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the baby's bruised face, its weak breath brushing against Diego's chest. But the baby was still there. Diego could feel that tiny heart, fragile but real. Mud coated his pants. Blood dripped from his hands onto the sharp rocks, but he didn't stop. He kept holding the cradle as if all of life depended on what was inside. When they finally reached the bank, he collapsed, soaked, gasping like someone who had just survived a storm. Diego sat on the wet grass, cradling the trembling child. He peeled the soaked blanket off the baby's small face, his own lips blue and barely moving. His heart pounded as he pressed his hand to the baby's chest. One heartbeat, then another, faint but present. The child was alive. It was still here. He closed his eyes for a moment. The rain struck his face, blending with the faint warmth rising from the tiny body against his chest. In that moment, the world seemed to stop. "You're alive. You're alive." Diego looked around. No one was there. No lights. Only wind-blown grass and swirling rain like a drenched curtain around him. He took off his heavy coat and, still shaking, wrapped it around the baby, as if shielding the most precious thing he had ever touched. The rain lashed against him, freezing his skin, but he didn't feel cold anymore. Maybe it was the barely there warmth soaking through his fingers, into each broken breath. The baby barely weighed 6 pounds, but it carried a silent, invisible weight. Like a wordless message, like a question with no answer. Diego felt his heart stir, not out of fear, but from something strange, as if he had stepped into a curve from which there was no turning back. Amid wind and thunder, he whispered, "I'll take you home. Don't be afraid." He rose, still trembling, and walked through the downpour, heading away from the lights of the old bridge, carrying a life he had just pulled back from the edge. That night, the black clouds kept drifting over the rusted rooftops like a soaked blanket no one had folded away. The whole neighborhood sank into silence after the torrential rain. Only a few yellow lights glowed behind the windows of small rooms. Water dripped steadily from bed sheets into plastic buckets in a dull rhythm, blending with the whistling wind slipping through cracked door frames. Diego ran down the slippery alley, his oversized coat wrapped tightly around something clutched against his chest. His breathing turned labored, each step sinking into puddles as if the world were trying to slow him down, but his eyes never left the small wooden house at the end of the row. Night had fallen completely. Neighboring windows flickered like candlelight and the wind whipped laundry lines like hands waving in the dark. What drove Diego forward wasn't fear, it was an invisible urgency to bring the baby home, quickly and safely. Inside the small tin-roofed room, Carmen was mending Valeria's coat by the dim light of an oil lamp. Her eyes squinted at the old thread, but her hands kept guiding the needle carefully through the worn seams. Every so often, she rubbed her shoulder to ease the ache. Next to her, Valeria was folding paper cranes, dipping her fingers in water to soften the edges. The air smelled of damp fabric and leftover wood smoke from the afternoon, mixed with the creaking of the old wooden door whenever the wind passed through. The room, though old, was orderly. The few belongings were neatly arranged, reflecting the frugal and patient life of a devoted mother. Outside, the moon was hidden by thick clouds, leaving only faint pale patches across the cracked tile floor. That night's dinner was just brown rice porridge with a few wild herbs, but Valeria didn't complain. She ate quietly, occasionally asking innocent questions about her paper birds. "If I let them go in the wind, do you think they could really fly?" Carmen smiled gently, but didn't answer right away. She kept stitching and then said softly, "Maybe, if I believe in it long enough." Everything seemed peaceful, just another quiet night among many poor ones. But beneath the worn stitches and quiet moments, something was drawing near, like a strange wind about to shatter the fragile calm. When the door suddenly blew open, Carmen thought it was just the wind again, but Diego's voice tightened her chest. "Mom, I need help. It's urgent." Carmen looked up and stood immediately when she saw the drenched boy, holding something wrapped in a thick coat. Jason was gasping for air, his cheeks flushed from wind and cold, his hands trembling, but he didn't let go of what he was holding. Margaret looked at him, stunned. "What did you do? Oh my God, what are you carrying in there?" "Oh, baby, Mom, someone left him by the river. I heard him crying. I didn't know what else to do." Margaret stepped forward and gently opened the coat. Inside was a small boy, his face red and bruised, clutching the edge of a blanket with tiny fingers. His body was ice cold, his lips pale, his breathing almost inaudible. "Oh dear Lord. Ashley, light the fire now. Jason, get me a dry towel, hurry." The room filled with tension. Ashley was struggling with the fireplace, the damp wood choking the room in thick smoke. Jason dug through his backpack and pulled out an old towel with shaking hands. Margaret laid the baby on a rug by the fire and began wiping him down with soft, deliberate motions, like a seasoned nurse. "Is he still alive, Mom?" Jason asked, eyes fixed on the child. "I don't know yet, but I'm not letting him go, no matter what." Ashley brought over an old blanket folded like a bird's nest, placed it by the fire and added dry wood. Beads of sweat began to appear on little Ethan's forehead, his frail breath shifting into a faint sigh. Margaret pressed her ear against his chest, eyes locked on every tiny movement, never breaking focus. Moments later, Edward returned. A man in his 50s, solid as an old oak in a storm, with sun-weathered skin and a face carved by years of labor. His calloused hands told the story of a life lived in quiet, steady work. Edward wasn't one to show emotion, but his presence always brought a calm to the home. He stood in the doorway holding a bag. No one spoke for several seconds. Then he stepped inside, set the bag down, and looked at the child. He took off his coat, pulled an old military jacket from the bag, and handed it to Margaret. "Wrap him tight. The fog's going to fall hard tonight." Margaret took it, and for a brief moment her eyes met Edward's, a silent agreement passing between them without a word. He sat down beside her, gently stroked Ethan's forehead, and silently stared into the flames. The whole room filled with the scent of wood and the soft crackle of glowing embers. Jason held a bowl of rice porridge, let it cool, and began feeding the baby. For the first time in his life, he was feeding someone whose name he didn't know. His past was a mystery, but who had already become a part of his world. Night fell. From the nearby streets came distant dog howls and, now and then, the voice of a street vendor breaking the silence. In the corner of the room, the baby slept peacefully in Jason's arms. His tiny hand clutched his new brother's finger, as if it had always known that embrace. Margaret still sat in her chair, a needle in hand but not stitching. She mumbled, almost to herself, "If someone's really looking for you, they won't leave you out in the rain. Love shouldn't be conditional." Ashley giggled. "I want to name him. His skin's as white as a milk roll and he looks like Ethan from that show I like." "Ethan, that's right. But from now on, this child is part of this family." That was all Edward said before going to check the locks on the door. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the fog hadn't lifted. The old wooden house felt warmer, as if a new breeze had awakened something within it. That night, no one went to bed early. They sat around the fire, silent but not cold. Each person carried their own thoughts, but they all knew something had changed deep in their hearts with the arrival of the baby. Margaret looked at Edward and saw in him a calm that only surfaced when the family was weathering a storm. Eventually, Jason drifted to sleep, still holding little Ethan's pinky. And in that small space, for the first time in years, the house seemed to breathe differently. No one knew what tomorrow would bring, but that night they had made a silent vow to protect the tiny life in their arms for one reason only: their hearts. Outside, the wind lashed the rusted metal sheets on the roof of the small store at the southern end of Willow Ridge. A few strands of dry grass shivered in the early season chill, sweeping across the muddy tracks left by the coal trucks that had passed earlier that morning. A torn flyer advertising discounted bread spun in the air and landed right at the doorstep. In the dim sky, layers of gray clouds knotted together like frayed wool, making the afternoon light feel even more faded and heavy. Inside the store, An old television perched on a high shelf buzzed steadily, mixing with the flat but tense voice of a news anchor. Breaking news: the Whitmore family is offering a $1 million reward for any information regarding the mysterious disappearance of their newborn son, a 2-month-old baby boy with pale skin and light brown hair, last seen last night in Willow Ridge. Jason froze in the aisle, one hand holding a baby bottle, the other clutching a squished sandwich. The letters flickered on the screen, then an image of a baby appeared. The child in the photo had slanted eyes, round cheeks, and a faint mark on his forehead. Everything around him blurred for a few seconds. Milk spilled from the bottle's neck, staining the worn slate floor. The store owner cleared his throat behind the counter, not looking at anyone in particular, but his voice was crystal clear. They say that baby belongs to the Whitmore Empire? $1 million, my God. With skin that pale? There's no mistaking it. Strange, isn't it? How he vanished during a thunderstorm overnight. Jason gripped the bottle tighter. His heart pounded like he had just woken from a long, disorienting dream. On his way home, cold winds slapped his face, but inside, he felt a burning heat he couldn't control. At that same moment, on the other side of town, a sleek black car pulled up in front of the Whitmore estate. In a luxurious room on the second floor, Richard Whitmore stood frozen before a large screen. The wine glass in his hand trembled slightly, the amber liquid glinting under the crystal chandelier. On the screen was the baby's face. Those eyes. So familiar they made his chest tighten. Richard reached out and turned off the TV, then let the glass fall to the table. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the room. He picked up the phone and dialed, his voice low and sharp. Find him immediately. He cannot remain outside our control. If anyone knows anything, eliminate him. No hesitation, no trace. A voice responded faintly on the other end, then fell silent. Richard clenched his jaw, his eyes burned with resolve. 3 days later, in the western slums of Willow Ridge, rumors began to spread. People spoke of a strange baby born during the storm, with skin unlike anyone else's in the neighborhood. Some street vendors claimed they'd seen Margaret rushing through the alley, carrying a baby wrapped in a wool blanket. Others swore they had heard crying around 2 a.m, long and desperate, like someone wanted it to be heard. One afternoon, just after the family had finished a modest dinner of tamales and cooked purslane, there was a knock at the door, and then silence. Edward opened the door but found no one in the yard. Only a folded note shoved beneath the threshold. Put it back where it belongs. If not, this family won't get a second chance. Edward said nothing. He placed the note on the table, poured himself a glass of water, and took a sip. His calm eyes looked at Jason, then at Margaret, who held Ethan tightly in her arms. Ashley, sitting beside her, looked up with a puzzled expression. Jason was the first to speak. "We need to leave." Edward nodded. No one in the family objected. That night, they packed in silence. Margaret slowly folded each piece of clothing for little Ethan, occasionally stopping to smooth a frayed thread on his tiny collar. Ashley carefully tucked her teddy bear into a small backpack, more delicately than she'd packed her school bag. She whispered, "He needs a friend, right, Mom? Maybe there won't be any teddy bears where we're going." Jason packed bread and medicine into a small bag. He looked out the window, where the streetlights flickered faintly, as if they might go out at any second. A vague anxiety gripped his chest. Edward put on the thickest coat he owned, stood at the doorway, and said quietly, "We leave tonight." The moon didn't rise. Along the narrow alley leading to the main road, shadows moved silently, like ghosts slipping through the night. Jason held his sister's hand tightly. He didn't know where the road would take them, but deep inside, one thing was certain. No matter what happened, Ethan would never return to that river. Night in the outskirts of Willow Ridge wasn't truly dark, more like a suspended dusk, floating between shadows and strips of yellow streetlight. The old houses remained quiet, long-standing witnesses to time. Eaves dripped rain steadily onto the sidewalk, where puddles shimmered under the cold winter wind, weaving through cracks and gaps. The trees lining the street swayed gently, dry leaves brushing against each other, forming a faint rustling song. In that atmosphere, it felt like the echo of footsteps belonged to someone who had left a story unfinished. "Let's go," Edward whispered, his voice deep and resolute as he looked back. His eyes swept the empty alley where the lantern's light cast fractured shadows on the peeling walls, like chipped paint slowly decaying. Margaret carried Ethan wrapped tightly in a thick coat. Jason carried an old backpack with some clothes, formula, and a thin blanket. Ashley walked beside their mother, clutching her teddy bear, eyes wide but tearless. They had been walking like this for nearly a week, without stable shelter, without clear light, relying only on temporary places Edward remembered from his years working construction, abandoned warehouses, church basements, even an old mechanic's shop with no electricity. Anywhere there were no people, that's where they stayed. And at every stop, they didn't truly sleep, they only closed their eyes and waited for dawn, as if fear had long since replaced rest. At the end of a crumbling old street, in a small chapel with moss-covered walls and loose shingles, they found Father Thomas Reed, a thin man with graying hair and eyes so kind they made people forget life's burdens. He didn't ask who they were or where they had come from. He simply looked at the child in Margaret's arms, opened the door, and said calmly, "Come in. In this world, no one deserves to be turned away for saving a life. You'll sleep here tonight," Father Thomas said, pointing to a small room behind the chapel. The scent of dampness and rotting wood filled their noses, but Margaret just nodded. She laid Ethan down on an old mattress, spread a towel underneath him, and the child fell into a peaceful sleep, unaware of the world trying to erase his existence. Jason sat by a cracked window, eyes fixed on the dark street, listening intently to every sound. He gently brushed Ethan's hair and whispered to himself, "You don't know how much this family has changed because of you." In the dim yellow glow of a flickering lamp, the ticking of the wall clock matched the heartbeat of a room too cautious to even breathe. Jason didn't look out the window as usual. Instead, he glanced at his mother and at Ashley's intertwined hands in the corner. There was a fragile tenderness in that moment that tightened his chest. He remembered the first time his mother had looked at Ethan, not with questions, not with complaints, just a silent gaze that seemed to recognize him from a place deep within her heart. That night, a strange wind swept through, not strong or cold, but carrying the scent of soil, rusted metal, and old rain. Jason heard the slow drag of footsteps over gravel. He stood and signaled Edward with a glance, but when the figure emerged from the shadows, they realized it was just a gum-celled boy, humming in broken Spanish, carrying his basket. The next morning, Margaret broke the last loaf of bread in half. She gave the larger piece to Jason, quietly, as always. No one in the Walker family ever ate enough, but no one complained. On those days, living meant breathing and being together in silence. Edward unfolded an old city map. He pointed out a safer route to Jason, one that bypassed the markets controlled by Richard Whitmore. They changed their departure time and split up to avoid suspicion. Some nights, they crawled through drainage tunnels, surrounded by the squeals of rats and the stench of mold. Other times, they slept on the rooftops of abandoned buildings, huddled beneath blankets cold as blades. Once, while hiding behind boxes near an industrial dump, Ashley asked in a quiet voice, "Mom, why do people hate a child just because he's white?" Margaret looked at her daughter and didn't answer right away. She stroked her hair and said, "Not everyone hates him. Some are afraid. Others are jealous, and some just never learned how to love. But I do. I love you. And that's enough." Ashley nodded and hugged her teddy bear tightly. She didn't ask any more questions. But from that night on, every time she slept, she wrapped her arms around Ethan, as if to build an invisible shield around him. That night, it didn't rain, but the wind howled fiercely. Jason kept watch and noticed a figure standing still on the other side of the road. It didn't move, it didn't smoke. It just stood there. One glance was enough for Edward to make the decision. "We have to leave this place," he said at dawn. He didn't explain further, and the family understood. They packed quietly. Margaret wrapped Ethan more carefully. Father Thomas gave them a bag of crackers and a bottle of water, then blessed them with the sign of the cross, his eyes filled with gentleness. "Thank you, Father," Margaret said softly. Thomas took her hand, then turned away without another word. As they walked, Jason asked in a low voice, "Where are we going now?" Edward looked at the folded map and pointed to an old industrial zone on the edge of town. "There's an abandoned warehouse. I worked near there years ago. It could be a temporary shelter, but after that, we'll need to think farther ahead." Margaret said nothing. She lowered her eyes, pressed her lips together, and held Ethan tightly, as if afraid he might vanish. The boy slept soundly, breathing steadily, though his lips moved as if calling out to someone in a dream. Jason gently brushed a strand of hair from his little brother's forehead, then looked up at the sky. The clouds were gathering, heavy, gray, pressing down like a suffocating blanket over the town. Another storm was approaching, and for them, it wasn't just rain, it was a sign that once again it was time to flee, to take another fragile gamble on hope. As they left the chapel, Diego looked back. Sunlight streamed behind the bell tower, illuminating an inscription carved into the door. "No one gets left behind." In that moment, those words weren't just letters in stone, they were a promise etched deep into the heart. Beneath the weathered wooden roof, 8 years had passed since the Walker family had arrived in Willow Ridge. Inside the house, the afternoon light slanted across the small room, where Ethan was crouched on the wooden floor next to the lowest drawer. The pale face of the 8-year-old stood out against the floorboards, and his tangled black hair hinted that he'd been running. A blade of grass stuck to his cheek, but he didn't brush it off. Ethan was staring intently at the scribbled drawings on a piece of paper, a picture of a house, a boy, and a girl playing under a tree. Suddenly, from a distance, a voice called out, "Ethan, where are you hiding?" It was Ashley's voice, her chestnut hair and eyes always glowing like fire. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at his drawing one last time, then gently closed the notebook and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He stood up and brushed off his pants. "I'm here!" he shouted as Ashley appeared from behind the fence. Ashley frowned. "Why didn't you answer me right away? You had me worried." Ethan smiled and shrugged. "I was thinking about our family." Ashley hesitated. She knew that whenever her foster brother spoke about our family, it was because he felt like an outsider, even though he was surrounded by love. "You just got back from school and already went to hide here?" she asked, hands on her hips. "Not exactly," Ethan muttered, looking up at the sky. "Today, Lucas asked me if we were real siblings. And what did you say?" I told him, "We're brothers in our hearts." Ashley was quiet for a moment, then walked over, took his hand, and led him toward the house. The autumn wind whispered over the roof, stirring something unspoken between the two children. In the small kitchen, Margaret was mending a shirt for Edward in the soft light filtering through the window. Her hands, wrinkled yet steady, guided the needle with precision. Jason, now a teenager, was reading at the wooden table. When Ashley and Ethan came in, the house felt warmer. "Mom," Ethan whispered, "can I ask you something?" Margaret looked up and smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." Why don't I have baby pictures like Ashley?" The needle in Margaret's hand paused. Jason glanced up at his brother, then looked toward their mother. Ashley turned away, pretending to get a glass of water. "I found a handkerchief in the drawer," Ethan continued. It had the initials LV embroidered on one corner. "Whose is it, Mom?" His voice was soft but steady. Margaret set the shirt aside, stood up, and walked into the kitchen. A hush settled over the room. Only the ticking of the clock and the soft crackle of the fire filled the silence. "I believe," Margaret said as she poured a glass of water, "that one day, when you're old enough, I'll tell you everything. But today isn't that day." Ethan lowered his head. "So, LV isn't really your name." "Ethan, you are my son," Margaret said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "Your name is a beautiful one, chosen by this family, not something left behind by someone else." Ethan nodded, though his eyes betrayed a quiet sadness. He turned and slowly climbed the wooden stairs. Jason stood as if to speak, but sat back down, clutching his book. Ethan's room was small, just enough for a twin bed, a shelf, and a drawer. He walked to the bottom drawer, opened it, and pulled out the embroidered handkerchief. The initials LV were still visible, though faded. He pressed it to his chest, as if trying to listen to his own heartbeat. Outside, the sun had set, and darkness spilled across the wooden floor. He stood and walked over to the mirror. What reflected back wasn't just the face of an 8-year-old boy. It was the swirl of a quiet storm within, not born of anger, but from not knowing who he truly was. He raised his hand, and gently touched the glass. He didn't smile, didn't ask, didn't search for answers. He just looked. A long look, as if trying to reach into his own heart to find something no one had dared to speak aloud. In the backyard, Ashley quietly gathered dry leaves. Jason leaned against a porch column, watching his sister collect them into a woven basket. "Do you think he's figured it all out?" Jason asked softly. Ashley didn't look up. "Enough to know he's not like the others in this house," Jason pressed on. "Are you upset with Mom for not telling him?" Ashley answered gently, "No, I think she's just waiting for the right moment." Jason sighed. "We could tell him, bit by bit." Ashley looked at him. "Or we could let him figure it out himself. He doesn't need to know everything right away to feel loved." Both fell silent. From upstairs, Ethan's voice called through the open window. "Ashley, I found a notebook with drawings of us when we were little." Ashley smiled sweetly and looked up. "Come down here. You need to help me redraw my teddy bear." In that peaceful moment, no one spoke of secrets. No one mentioned biological fathers or blood ties, but everyone felt something certain: that true connection isn't measured by the things people usually use to define it. It lives in the fact that a child is called by a name given by those who may not share his blood, but share his love. And in that gentle silence, the roots of Ethan, though not of blood, continued to grow, sprouting from the warm soil of a family's love that had nourished him with humble meals, warm embraces on cold nights, and tender looks instead of long explanations. 17 years had passed. Ethan Walker was now 25 and had worked as a community doctor for nearly 4 years in a rural area long forgotten by progress. He placed several bottles of cough syrup onto a wooden shelf, the calluses on his hands still carrying the scent of medicinal herbs. Outside, a group of children played hide and seek, their laughter drifting through sunlit curtains. Ethan quietly stepped out, letting the morning breeze tousle his hair. His clinic was modest and rustic, yet impeccably tidy. Dark wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with hand-labeled bottles in blue ink. In one corner, handwritten home remedies were pinned with neat, careful strokes. On the desk stood a tall glass jar holding dried branches he had picked from the hillside behind the clinic, now yellowed after 2 dry seasons. Small bundles tied with jute string sat beside dark salves he had prepared with precision. On dry summer afternoons, young mothers arrived with feverish children. The elderly came with trembling hands, hoping for relief from pain, and even lost travelers stopped in just to ask, "Is there something hurting, young man?" They all came because they knew someone was listening, not through a stethoscope, but with a heart. Ethan didn't need to say much. A simple phrase like, "Don't worry, this too shall pass," was enough to send them home in peace. That morning, the air carried the sweet scent of wildflowers from the hills. A gentle breeze creaked the window open. A fresh green leaf floated in and landed on the exam table. Ethan picked it up and placed it next to a patient file. "Dawn, Ethan, my eyes. They can see again. Not clearly, but I see light. Is it yellow or white?" The trembling voice of Mrs. Felicia Carter, who had been blind for nearly 2 years, fluttered with the breeze. Ethan bent down, gently helped her to her feet, and smiled at her. "It's pale yellow, like chrysanthemums in late fall." "Yes, that's what I imagined." She smiled, toothless, and with shaking hands, pulled out a folded piece of fabric from her pocket. "I embroidered it from memory. I don't know if it's pretty, but it's for you, because you see people with your heart." Ethan took it. His eyes lingered on the cloth for a long moment. The embroidery was simple, but unmistakable. A leaning branch, 2 nests of different sizes, one empty and one filled with tiny birds. He gently ran his fingers along the edge and quietly placed it in a drawer beside an old faded photo of himself, Jason and Ashley laughing under a plum tree from long ago. That afternoon was neither cold nor warm. Ethan stepped into the old storage room in the middle of town to look for gauze. As he moved a box aside, he discovered a wooden chest tucked in a corner. A thick layer of dust told of years of neglect. He was surprised. It was where Jason used to keep personal belongings when he still ran the clinic. Ethan crouched down, brushed off the dust, and opened the lid. Inside were stacks of files in yellowed plastic sleeves, many of them damp along the edges. On top was an unmarked file with a hastily written note. unclassified, for internal review only. Inside was a yellowed birth certificate, a baby photo in the corner, and a handwritten note from Jason. Do not disclose. Do not confirm. But if Ethan finds this, tell him the truth. He pulled out another file stamped with faded red ink. Unclassified records. Again, a birth certificate, the same photo, and a faint birthmark behind the left ear of the baby. Ethan touched the paper. His heart beat softly but steadily, like a lonely drum in an empty room. Under father, a name had been scratched out, but the smeared ink made it unmistakably clear. Richard Whitmore. He sat in silence for a long time. Then, with care, he put everything back, closed the chest, and left the dusty room. That night, he sat for hours on the back steps of the clinic, staring out at the parched fields and the gnarled, dying plum trees. He rubbed the fabric of his shirt, as if trying to hold on to something ordinary amid the tremors inside him. 3 days later, a carefully sealed envelope arrived. Ethan received it in his damp palm, holding it as though it contained something fragile. Most people had gone to the spring festival downtown, and the place was silent except for the slow whir of the ceiling fan and the sunlight slicing through the window bars. Ethan placed the envelope on the table. He stared at it for a long while, but didn't open it. He stepped outside and followed the back path to an empty field where Edward Walker's orchard used to be. The plum trees had turned gray. Some were dead, yet they still stood, silent witnesses to harvests long gone. A westerly breeze carried the scent of pine resin and wood smoke from the hillside homes. On his way, he stopped by the medicine cabinet and picked up the embroidery from Mrs. Felicia Carter. He didn't know why, but he felt he needed to take it. The ground was still damp from last week's rain. Every step Ethan took left a clear footprint. Sparrows darted out from the shrubs. No one was waiting for him there, and no one needed to be. He sat on a stone beside a withered plum tree and gently pulled the document from the envelope. The father's name written in black ink and formal type, Richard Whitmore. It was no longer a possibility, nor a suspicion. It was a stark, undeniable truth. Ethan folded the paper and rested it on his knee. The night wind carried the scent of soil and sap. He closed his eyes. So it was you. You were the one who left me by the frozen river that night when no one was watching. No one heard him, but maybe the wind kept that sentence as a silent witness to a truth finally spoken. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stayed there for a long time until the moon rose above the hills. In that moment, he realized he was no longer the abandoned child. He was the only one who could close that chapter. The embroidery was still in his hand. Branch, empty nest, full nest. A message from someone invisible, yet clearer than any beam of light. The first sunlight over Hope City didn't blaze. It fell in long, quiet, somber rays. The glass towers, tall as memories no one dared to touch, stood still in the cold gray of a city that seemed asleep. A soft wind swept through the old benches along Progress Walk, brushing the stone seats and dragging a few time-worn papers behind it. A man stepped out of the subway, carrying an old leather briefcase over one shoulder, his white shirt unpressed, his shoes dusted with city grime. He stopped in front of an old stone wall where the names of the founders of Whitmore Technologies Corporation were engraved, a corporate empire no one had ever dared challenge. Richard Whitmore's name was still at the top, etched in bronze as if it had never faded. Ethan Walker looked up at the name. For a brief moment, a faint smile crossed his face, not a smile of victory or contempt, but a quiet note in the silence of a symphony. He stepped into the lobby. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with short hair and carefully lined eyes, eyed him with suspicion at first. But when she saw the business card and the letter of reference from the health organization at St. Benedict Parish, her tone softened. Mr. Whitmore doesn't work here anymore. He retired over 5 years ago. His health isn't good. He lives in a private residence in the southern suburbs now. But he doesn't receive visitors, except for nurses and doctors. Ethan nodded. I'm a doctor. After a pause, he added, Father Thomas Reed sent me. The woman hesitated, then picked up the phone and spoke in a low voice, as if asking for something very serious. Half a minute later, she hung up and nodded. He agreed. You have 20 minutes. The taxi crept through the wealthiest neighborhood on the south side of the city. Century-old trees lined the road, trimmed like living sculptures. Ethan gazed out the window, calm but alert. He didn't remember this place, yet everything felt disturbingly familiar, like something he had once dreamed or endured. The mansion had French architecture, white walls, a dark roof, thick wooden doors, stone columns at the entrance, and wrought iron railings. A maid opened the door and led him down a hallway lined with pale red carpet, where the echo of his steps made it sound like he was walking alone. The living room was spacious, without unnecessary luxury. Just an old sofa, bookshelves along the wall, and an elderly man with silver hair seated in a leather armchair, his back to the window. His hand trembled lightly on the armrest. The maid whispered, "Mr. Whitmore, the doctor has arrived." He turned slowly. The light from the window illuminated Ethan's face, and Richard remained motionless. His eyes widened, and his hand tightened around the cane. Is that you?" Ethan didn't respond right away. He stepped toward a small side table beside the leather armchair, opened his briefcase, and placed 3 objects on top of it. A DNA test result with an international laboratory's red seal, a faded photograph of a baby wrapped in a blanket by the roots of a tree along a riverbank, eyes closed, skin pale. And finally, a thin, worn, silver-white handkerchief, still bearing faint embroidery, LV. Richard stepped back, leaning against the armchair as if his balance had slipped. His throat dried instantly. His gaze lingered on the handkerchief, as if the memory it held caused him physical pain. His mother. She embroidered it herself, he murmured, more to himself than to Ethan. The young man stood still, no trace of bitterness or anger in his eyes. "I didn't come here to claim a place," he said slowly. "I'm not here to demand accountability either. I just want to know why." Richard looked at him. For a brief moment, the air seemed to vanish from the entire room. He opened his mouth but only exhaled, followed by a shaky cough. Ethan didn't help him. He let the man wrestle with his breath, not out of cruelty, but because he knew this was a moment Richard had to face on his own, at least once in his life. After a few minutes, when the coughing had subsided, Richard leaned on his cane and slowly walked toward the window. "Because I was afraid," he said in a raspy voice. "Because I was a coward. I had a family, at least on paper. I had power, status. If it came out that you were my son with a woman outside of marriage, everything would have crumbled." Ethan remained silent. "But you survived," Richard turned back, eyes filled with tears. "And you grew up like this, strong, decent, nothing like me." Ethan took a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was a handwritten letter, bold script. "I didn't come to pass judgment. I came to face what didn't destroy me and made me stronger." He placed it on the table, bowed his head slightly in respect, then turned away. Before leaving the room, he said just one sentence, without looking back. "I lived well, not because of you, but because of the people who shared no blood with me, who raised me with their whole hearts." The door closed gently behind him. In the room, Richard Whitmore remained standing. The evening light filtered through the window, casting his shadow onto the mosaic floor. Alone, trembling, and colder than he had ever been. A dim winter morning light blanketed the city in a pale gray. Passers-by rushed by with collars turned up, the sound of tires hissing on wet asphalt blending with sharp car horns. In that setting, it felt as if something was quietly shifting. Inside the newsroom of the Willow Ridge Gazette, an elderly woman with silver hair reviewed the latest headline before it went to press. Her coffee cup still gave off steam. Beside her, a printout displayed a headline that weighed heavily on the soul. "I wasn't a lost child. I was abandoned." The article was signed Ethan Walker. Ethan hadn't slept the night before. He had sat in his small office inside the community health center in southern Hope City, where the paint on the walls had started to fade and the smell of disinfectant still lingered faintly. On his desk was a draft, revised over and over again, each version erasing a little more anger, replacing it with quiet resolve. No one had told him what to write, but deep down he knew it wasn't a denunciation, nor was it revenge. It was a story, of someone thrown away, saved, and who had tried to rise again thanks to the hands of those who shared no blood with him. He began the article with a question that had followed him since childhood. Why did you leave me by the river? Then the words poured out, one by one, as if the answer didn't come from the man who abandoned him, but from the path Ethan had walked for 25 years of his life. By 10 a.m., the article was published. Within less than an hour, online forums erupted. First came those who had followed the missing child case tied to the Whitmore Corporation. Then came independent journalists, human rights bloggers, civil society organizations, and finally, the entire digital community. What started as a personal story had become a national matter. Some were shocked, others wept, others burned with anger, but most notable of all was the prolonged silence of Richard Whitmore. In his mansion at the end of a secluded boulevard on the city's west side, Richard sat in the living room. The TV was on, but silent. The light from the screen flickered across his aged face, tracing every wrinkle born from unspoken fatigue. He held the remote in one hand, but didn't use it. His eyes were locked onto the image of the son he once denied, now appearing on the midday news. Authorities had reopened the case file. The yellowed pages were retrieved from archives, and statements once ignored were now being reviewed. Under public pressure, federal officials ordered an investigation into legal manipulation, cover-ups, and unethical conduct linked to Richard Whitmore. One of his former associates, the one tasked with monitoring the Walker family, had been arrested while attempting to flee the state. In his testimony, he referred to a verbal order from higher up. Everyone knew who he meant, but no one dared to say it aloud. A series of emails and forged documents, dating back 25 years, had been leaked to the press. There were anonymous letters threatening witnesses, altered medical records, and even a contract labeled juvenile recovery. While the country remained divided, Ethan appeared at a forum held at Riverbend Community College, surrounded by students, faculty, factory workers from nearby industrial parks, and a few single mothers. He didn't stand at a podium. He chose to sit among the people. His voice was soft but unwavering. I lived in fear, fear of being found out, fear of being taken away, fear that the love I received wasn't really mine. But I realized the scariest thing isn't being abandoned. It's when all of us remain silent in the face of injustice. An elderly woman wiped tears from her cheeks. A 6-year-old boy sitting on his mother's lap looked at Ethan as if he were witnessing something far bigger than he could comprehend. Ethan shared that the Walker family, despite not being related by blood, once split half a loaf of bread with him. That his adoptive mother hand-washed his ragged little handkerchief every single day, that there were nights when they slept beneath bridges, but never once did they leave him without holding him close. Instead, he said slowly, the man who had everything threw me away like trash. He paused before finishing. But today, I'm not here to stir up guilt. I'm here to affirm that people like me are not mistakes. We are part of this society and we deserve a place to begin again. At the close of the forum, Ethan announced the creation of a humanitarian center called Rooted Haven, a place where the question wasn't where a child came from, but what they needed. A place where they would receive a home, medical care, education, and most importantly, welcome. The response was immediate. Hundreds of handwritten letters poured in from across the country. A carpenter in Arizona sent $100, 0 cents with a shaky note. I don't have much, but I was abandoned too. Thank you for saying what I never could. A widow in Maine mailed in her late husband's wedding ring with a note that read, if it can be sold, use it to buy one more bed. Richard Whitmore was never convicted, but he was never pardoned either. His partners withdrew, subsidiaries dissolved, and his household staff refused to return. One day, he walked out to his backyard and stared at the stone monument erected for a son who never came home. He asked himself aloud, who put this here for me? That child, once discarded, was now protecting hundreds. And justice, at last, had come, without anyone needing to knock on a door. In the outskirts of Willow Ridge, a gentle breeze swept across fields of dry, golden grass. The tall stalks bent in the wind, as if whispering an ancient tale. In the distance, a tractor climbed a hill slowly, leaving a trail of fine dust that vanished into the crisp autumn air. The wooden door of the small medical center creaked open. Jason Walker stepped out, his hands still faintly smelling of alcohol. He walked slowly toward the bench by the porch, where a young man sat holding a worn fabric handkerchief with frayed edges. Ethan Walker didn't look up when Jason approached. His gaze remained fixed on the open yard ahead, where a group of children played beneath the poplars, their laughter echoing like a wordless lullaby. Jason sat beside him, not saying anything at first. He simply placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, a gentle gesture, without pressure, but enough to remind him he wasn't alone. After a while, Ethan whispered, his voice slow and halting, "Mom." She passed peacefully. Ashley said she held her hand until the very end, Jason nodded, looking toward the horizon, where the sunset painted streaks of red and gold across the distant mountains. "She was always strong," Jason said, "but she never made you carry that weight." Ethan clutched the handkerchief tighter between his fingers. It was the old brown one Margaret Walker had kept for over 20 years, now returned to his hands, as if the final circle had closed. "Do you remember?" Ethan asked softly. "When I was 6, and you carried me to the old clinic for my vaccine? It was raining, my shoes were soaked, and you placed this handkerchief on my back so I wouldn't get wet?" Jason let out a quiet chuckle. "Yeah, I remember. You were trembling like a leaf in the wind, terrified of the needle, but you still pretended to be brave." Ethan smiled and looked down. His eyes were red, but he didn't cry. Sometimes the weight of adulthood is heavier than tears. "Back then, I thought you were a hero. To be honest, I still do." Jason didn't respond right away. Another gust of wind carried the scent of dry grass and damp pine. After a pause, Jason asked, "Do you feel relieved now?" Ethan nodded slowly. Relieved, but not at peace. It was just the right moment. Both men fell silent. The world seemed to shrink into that quiet space. No more words were needed, just each other's presence, and that was enough. Inside the house, Ashley was sorting through a stack of old photographs. She found one of Margaret sitting on a bench, holding a young Ethan in her arms, a serene smile on her face. Beside the photo was a handwritten letter, in a familiar slanted script. Ashley picked it up and carefully brought it outside to Ethan. He read it that night. In the warm glow of the amber lamp, the words came to life, like the voice of a mother who never needed blood to love. "My son, I didn't give you life, but every time you called me mom, I was reborn. I thought I would die quietly, like so many poor women before me, but you came to me like a miracle, like an answer I never dared to pray for. I am your mother. No papers, no shared blood, just a trembling heart moved by your laughter. If one day you choose to search for your biological father, I won't stop you, but I want you to know that sometimes the one who gives us life isn't the one who teaches us how to live it." Ethan folded the letter carefully, placed it in the photo album, and sat there for a long while, his hand resting on the photo of his mother, as if trying to hold on to a lifetime through a single touch. A few hundred miles away, inside a luxury nursing home on the outskirts of the city, Richard Whitmore sat in a wheelchair, staring out through the thick glass of a tall window. The sunset lit up his fully white hair, casting a soft haze over everything. He lived in silence, surrounded by oil paintings and leather-bound books no one touched. No one had visited him in months. Richard had once had everything: wealth, power, respect. But when all that slipped away, he was left with only one thing to face: himself. And that was something he had never learned how to do. At a charity conference, when a journalist asked Ethan, "Have you ever thought of visiting him?" Ethan smiled, not with bitterness or anger, but with a calm that had taken years to build. "No," he replied, "because I've already been there." And I said what I needed to say, in silence. That night, Jason sat again on the bench outside the clinic. The moon rose late, casting a dim silver light over the ground. Ethan stepped out, arms full of medical textbooks, ready for the first session of his new technical training course. "My first class is tomorrow," Ethan said. "Are you ready?" Jason asked. "Not yet," Ethan replied, "but I don't think it has to be perfect. I just need Mom's patience and your silence." Jason smiled. "There will always be a place for you here, not just because you're my brother, but because you're a part of this place." Ethan nodded. When he went back inside, he placed the old handkerchief into a wooden frame beside his mother's photo and the handwritten letter, not as decoration, but as a reminder. Not everyone who gives us life is a parent, and not everyone who didn't give us life stops being family. Outside, the wind still blew gently, but inside that man's heart, a final page had turned, not with a period, but with acceptance. The rusted iron gate of the old estate creaked open, as if even it regretted leaving the past behind. Ethan Walker walked along the rugged, time-worn gray stone path that led to the three-story mansion built in a classical style. Once a symbol of power and wealth, everything now lay under a thick layer of dust and time. The stone statues lining the path were cracked, many without heads. The rose bushes, once carefully trimmed, were now a field of weeds tangled with dry ferns and withered vines. Ethan brought nothing with him except a bundle of documents tied with a brown cloth ribbon. This journey was something he had to make alone, just like his existence for the past 25 years. Quiet, steady, and irreplaceable. The man who opened the door was an elderly butler, white-haired and hunched. He looked at Ethan for a moment, then gave a silent nod. He led him inside at a slow pace, as if time inside that house moved differently, slower, thicker, nearly untouchable. Ethan stepped into the main hall. Everything seemed preserved, just as it had been the day he was taken from that place, though he had been too young then to remember. But now he could feel everything by instinct. The portrait of a young Richard Whitmore hanging on the central wall, his stern eyes still watching every soul that passed through the house. The crystal chandeliers hung silently from above, covered in dust, like a curtain concealing an ancient truth. The main hall was at the end of the corridor. The heavy wooden door creaked open, revealing a spacious room where the evening light filtered through frosted glass, stretching into golden strips across the carpet. Richard Whitmore sat there, the man who had once symbolized power and cruelty, now reduced to a frail silhouette in an old wheelchair. His eyes, dimmed by age and illness, flickered when he saw Ethan. Something inside him sparked, like a fragile flame rising from cold ashes. He had recognized Ethan the moment he stepped into the estate, and he knew this day had come. Ethan walked forward and placed the folder on the coffee table. He didn't sit down, not wanting to sink into the plush cushions of a house built on lies. He remained standing, firm and calm, like a tree that had not grown under the warmth of family affection, but in the darkness of neglect, nourished by the kindness of those who shared no blood with him. Richard reached out and touched the folder's cover. His fingers trembled, as if he were touching something truly alive for the first time. Engraved in silver on the cover were the words, "A place where every child is welcome, even the abandoned ones." Richard lingered on that phrase for a long moment. He didn't need to open it. He already knew what it contained. It was the detailed plan for the center named Rooted Haven, which Ethan had committed to building to help children who had been abandoned, abused, or simply unwanted by those who gave them life. Ethan knelt down, not to beg, but to look directly into the eyes that had rejected him from his very first breath. He spoke in a steady, quiet voice, each word carefully chosen, not loud, not spiteful. "I survived, even though you didn't want me to." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out, just a hoarse breath, as if he wanted to speak but no longer had the strength. Ethan didn't stop. "I had a father, but it wasn't you. I had a mother, though we weren't related by blood. I had a family who never saw me as a burden. None of them left me out in the cold rain. None of them abandoned me out of fear for their reputation. I didn't come today to ask for your forgiveness. I came to forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I need to leave here in peace. But even though I forgive you, you're alone now. You'll live the rest of your days in solitude. Maybe that's the price you have to pay." He stood up without waiting for a reply. Richard didn't call after him. He just sat there, his empty hands resting on his lap, his vacant eyes following the man walking away. Ethan left the estate. The heavy wooden door closed behind him. He didn't look back. The breeze outside carried the chill of autumn, but also a crisp clarity. On the stone steps, the fading light of evening fell gently, decisively. He crossed the old courtyard through the iron gate that clanged shut behind him, leaving behind a bitter, heavy past. And then, as if to softly close the chapter, the distant ringing of church bells echoed, a reminder that every person deserves the chance to begin again, even those once cast aside. Ethan looked up at the sky, his eyes bright with calm. He wasn't seeking justice for himself, but hope for those most vulnerable, and for the first time in 25 years, he felt truly born, not by the man who lived in that house, but through the act of choosing not revenge, not hatred, but forgiveness, and moving forward. Perhaps, after hearing this story, something deep remains within each of us. A question without an easy answer, an old wound resurfacing, or a quiet hope that goodness still lives in this world. Ethan's story wasn't just about finding his biological father. It was a journey to face his pain so he would no longer carry it like a silent sentence in his heart. He didn't choose hatred. He didn't seek revenge on the man who abandoned him. He chose forgiveness, not because that man deserved it, but because Ethan understood that forgiveness is a way of freeing oneself. Richard had to live out his days with guilt, loneliness, and collapse. That was the harshest sentence, one no court on earth could impose. And Ethan, the child once left behind, became the one to build a sanctuary for other children just like him, those who had been hurt. This is the rightful reward for those who, even in the deepest darkness, still choose the path of kindness. Dear friend, after this story, have you ever wondered what truly makes someone a good person? Is it blood, social status, or the way they choose to treat others, even when there's nothing in it for them? Do you believe that kindness, no matter how small, always finds its way back in the most meaningful way? And if you're in a difficult place, if you're carrying stories you haven't dared to share, are you willing to open your heart, move forward, and forgive yourself first? Please share how you feel in the comments below. I would truly love to read every heartfelt word you want to express. And if you're feeling lonely today, if you're carrying a pain that no one else has seen, I want you to know you are not alone. Are you doing okay? How's your health, your spirit these days? Don't hesitate to leave a greeting, an emoji, or even just type, "I saw this," so we know you're still here, walking this healing journey with us. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next story, where justice continues to shine from the human heart.